Good morning, everyone. It is 11:04 Eastern Time, and I am super excited to see everyone out there, so to speak. Hey, our tech crew, could I please have full view? There we go, so everyone can see us. Hello, this is Michael Musante to my right or to your left, or whichever way you're looking at it. I'm Jeanne Allen. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Education Reform, and we are so delighted to have you this morning on part 2 of our Ed Innovation virtual series, really digging into what it is that people across the country, public, private, charter, are doing to help our kids, our students in this crisis. So first, let me just pause and say that we at the Center for Education Reform, like you, hope you're all safe. And we're waking up every morning trying to do our best to not only cut the curve for ourselves of the disease, but to cut the curve for students everywhere. CER, some of you know, is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, ed reform, full service ed reform organization in the country, cutting our teeth back in the 90s on endorsing changes to the system that would allow excellence and parent-driven, student-centered education to thrive. And so it is not unusual for us to jump into a crisis to try to do our part, but we're just bystanders, and we really look to the experts and the leaders out there doing the hard work to make things happen. So we're super excited to have about 300 people joining us today. This will be on video afterwards and recording. Just a couple of housekeeping. Use the Q&A function. Depending on time, we'll bring you live. Otherwise, Michael and I will be reading questions. Use the panelists' Twitter handles, which are all on their name. And what else, Michael, should we talk about before we bring our panelists on?
I would just say, to your point, we know there are a lot of you out there on the front lines as teachers, as instructors, as educators, all of you parents who for the first time have been thrown feet first into the fire here in the education of your children. We feel your pain, not to use a term from back in the 90s, Jeannie, but we fully understand and are just trying to present these to bring practical solutions to you, to try to help you get through this until things start to return a little to normal.
And I will say that in a couple weeks, we're going to have our third, and we're going to be switching a lot to policy, because right now, as we begin to bring the panelists in, if we would do that, please, we know that part of what's preventing us all from getting to the students and getting the education they need and deserve are barriers in policy. And so some of you out there are doing your best to go under, over, and through the policy barriers, and we want to be as supportive as we can. Let's get Mark on there as well, and then I'm going to start making intros. So depending on where your box is, raise your hand. Jamie Candee, President and CEO of EdMentum. Welcome. Good morning, Jamie. Working all over the country and internationally to charge, if you will, schools and curriculum to reach students and professionally support teachers everywhere. Thank you for joining us. Mark Gleason, Executive Director, Philadelphia School Partnership. Mark, raise your hand. You work across Philadelphia, public, private, and charter, just distributed a bunch of devices, are working on high tech as well as low tech. Super excited to have you with us. Gregg McGough, Director of Curriculum, Columbia, Pennsylvania Borough School District, not too far from Harrisburg, PA, one of the many innovative school leaders out there in the public education system. Good morning, welcome for being here. And Stephanie Saroki, last but not least, Managing Director, Seton Education Partners, working in several states, several places with schools, charter and Catholic schools, and look forward to hearing more. And so I'm just going to dive in and ask you guys one by one to talk just a little briefly about what you did to jump into this crisis. And then we'll kind of do a little deeper dive on where we are. Let's go ahead and start with Jamie.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay, Jeannie? Great. Thanks for having me. So at EdMentum, we currently serve about 5 million students in the United States, about half of the school districts, many charter schools. And for us, the last 4 to 6 weeks has really been about building capacity within our educator community. Really big challenge to move to distance learning. And so both supporting teachers as well as supporting parents, especially for those of us who have the youngest learners right now, your elementary students, we've been spending a large amount of our time really streamlining access to our programs. So everything from our printables to our ed tech programs, being able to provide those free of charge initially as we were getting up to speed, and then really working on how do we build capacity, how do we think about policy changes, how do we create safety, how do we serve our students with learning differences. So it's been a lot of focus on professional development, a lot of focus on streamlining and making as efficient as possible our new concept of the classroom, all done virtually. So that has been a big amount of our work for the last month or so.
And sorry, as I'm muting myself. And Jamie, when you think about the way you had to sort of transition, on one hand, you're already in the business of delivering education through and online, right?
Yes. Yeah.
When you think about the challenge of all of a sudden getting hit with people across the country, what's the one thing that you maybe had to do differently?
You know, I think the one thing that we should think about as a system doing differently is it shouldn't take a pandemic for us to figure out how to plan for the inevitable. There's, you know, we serve districts all over the southern United States that frequently get hit with hurricanes as an example. And so those districts and those communities that have gone through those kinds of natural disasters, they were ready. We had them, you know, within 24 hours, fully virtual. They still had to sort through some of the hardware accessibility and equity issues. You know, those are things that will be continuous challenges, but those communities were ready to go versus, you know, other parts of the country that haven't experienced it. And so we need to be thinking always about how does the continuum of learning continue for all students? And we have to be planning that through our natural course of policy and planning. We all, public-private partnerships, all of us need to be working together on what are the best practices. How do we get those out into the communities that need them? Let's not be creating, you know, things from scratch when there are really, really good models of virtual education that already exist, and we need to get them into the hands of educators all over the country. So that's the piece that I would really recommend we focus on.
Thank you for that. Let me transition to Gregg with that, because Gregg, again, this was not necessarily natural to you. Tell us a little bit about your district, and I would say also that we'll share later, or you should share with folks the amazing database you created, just knowing that your teachers needed something out there. But you jumped into this and were not prepared. You were one of those areas that Jamie mentioned, but somehow you were able to transition where others, we'll talk about in a few minutes, weren't. And we do have to solve that challenge. So how did you do it and why?
So we were in the unique position on Friday the 13th, coincidentally. I'm the only one here on screen, but I want it known that I represent an amazing admin team, superintendent, faculty, staff, student body. So even though I'm only one person sitting here, I want it known that I'm here representing the entire Columbia Borough School District team, because if not for the team, there's no way we would have been able to make the transition the way we did. So very quickly, we're a very small school, 2.4 square miles. We share the exact same boundary as our borough, which allows us to move very quickly on things because we have similar interests. We push somewhere in the neighborhood of about 65% poverty. And so we're a very high needs, high poverty school district. And so we are one-to-one, but we're slowly making the transition, evolutionary wise. And all of a sudden, on March 13th, we have a professional development day, and we were receiving reports from our Secretary of Education, and found out that we were going to be closed for at least 2 weeks. And so we told our staff, and that was the last day that we physically were in the same space as our staff. Since then, we've made the transition. If someone, I keep telling colleagues, if someone had come to me and said, you have a year to transition your entire school to an online environment, I'd have laughed at them. In fact, my superintendent, Tom Strickler, the day on that Friday the 13th, I remember him turning to me and saying, I'm the director of curriculum. There's only 2 of us in the district office. We're very small. He turned to me and he goes, well, I guess we're going we're going virtual. And I said, Tom, no. And he goes, oh, no, I'm not asking you. I'm telling you, we're going virtual. And I went, okay. And I kind of walked away and I just sort of processed, because in education, we're very much data-driven, data-centric. So we always want to make sure that, we look at everything and we study it and we go to committees. And well, this pandemic has sort of pushed us in a way of pushed us to think differently, right? So I think that's where we are right now. So that Sunday, very briefly here, and I talk too much, so there's other panelists, so I'll be fast. But on that Sunday, we started receiving emails from groups like EdMentum and others who realized there was going to be a need. And so on that Sunday afternoon, after lunch with the family, I sat down and just put together a quick Google site to try and just warehouse resources, so that we were under the thought or thinking that we were going to be out 2 weeks. So I just wanted something to be a stopgap measure. So Google Sites are free. We quickly launched literacy and numeracy and got that out for everybody. My superintendent, when I shared it with him on Monday morning, was very excited. And then that began our first phase in this transition. So that's kind of a little bit who we are and what we're about. We started our planned instruction yesterday. And so we are fully integrated in planned instruction on yesterday. And so, that's kind of where we are. I'm sure we're not unique, but very excited to be able to share our story with you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Gregg. Stephanie, let me bring you into the conversation. I want you to talk a little bit about Seton. You've been no stranger to blended learning. I know that virtual was not necessarily the focus. So what did you do? What number of schools did you have to roll it out among? And then how do you go from there?
Great. Honored to be here, Jeannie. And for the folks on my team who may be listening, I really hope I do your extraordinary work justice today. We're a national network of character-rich, academically excellent, and for families who choose, faith-inspiring schools. We have 3 lines of work, so we are a complicated organization. All in underserved communities, all in the elementary and middle school levels. A network of 13 Catholic schools we partner with across the country that collectively serve more than 3,000 students. A network of 3 charter schools serving nearly 1,000 children in the South Bronx, and a new Catholic academy that we will fully own and operate this fall called Romero in Ohio. What did we do first? Before the majority of governors even announced school closures, we created an emergency task force. So we are not big on committees, but we did have a task force on both sides of our work, our Catholic work and our charter work. In New York City, with our charter work, this included our ED, our superintendent, our CFO, our CAO, our CTO, 2 of our 3 principals, but importantly, it also included our director of character initiatives, and I'll talk about that briefly. For our Catholic schools, our emergency task force was small and nimble. A huge advantage in generating and distributed resources widely across 3,000 plus children. Before New York City made the decision to shut their schools, and before Ohio and other governors had made the decision, we sent children home with backpacks full of books and 2 weeks worth of learning materials. This was days before the schools were officially shuttered. We worked nonstop over a handful of days to develop a thoughtful plan and tiered resources that we were able to send to leaders and teachers in waves. So what was the most important thing for them to get in week 1 versus what was the most important thing for them to get in week 2 and week 3 and week 4, and it's going to change in the future, I expect. All of our schools, as you mentioned, Jeannie, are robust blended learning schools, so we were able to leverage our existing relationships with organizations like EdMentum and iReady and Lexia to go from school to home learning really fast. In New York City, we established and communicated clear expectations for all staff. This was really important. Teachers, yes, but also our operations team, our janitorial staff, our social workers, our counselors. We set expectations for what a new schedule would look like. We would need all hands on deck. For teachers, one expectation we set from the beginning, to call every student for 20 to 30-minute deep learning sessions and well-being checks. Plus, any child who doesn't log in during the day gets a call that same day.
Wow.
In New York City, we canceled spring break. I'll pause there because I know that sounds extraordinary, but I will say that families welcomed this decision. What we did for staff is we allowed them to choose 4 days of vacation between now and the end of the school year. And with a little logistical gymnastics, we could provide all staff a break while also executing on a robust blended learning plan. And then briefly, we secured internet access for 1/3 of our families to ensure continued learning at home. We issued computers to nearly 700 children in New York City, and our Catholic schools did the same for families who didn't have computers. We created a tech helpline. This has been incredibly helpful. So a helpline and an email that our ops team leads to troubleshoot connectivity and other computer issues. On day 1, 85% of our students were logging in and learning. That percent climbed to 92% by day 2 and continues to climb. And then one thing we did not do, we did not lower expectations for children with special needs. Our student services team is providing twice weekly one-on-one tutorials in addition to homeroom teacher calls. Plus, depending on a student's IEP, we're providing weekly counseling sessions for up to 1 hour. I could go on.
I want you to but let's shift for a second. I mean, it's fantastic, and what I love is you said everything from sort of making the call, also reaching out to your partners that you already have, and what I'm also seeing is this trend as we sort of shift to Mark, this trend in kind of what do we have, assess and appraise, what you can do, start getting ready, and move. And that's, I think, what a lot of people, certainly a lot of our participants out there who I'm seeing are asking questions already, some pre-asked questions, are kind of not knowing what to do yet, right? They're challenged by it. So Mark, as we transition to you, big system, right? Stephanie's working across a very big city and bureaucracy, but she's got a charter network. She's nimble. Gregg's got 2.4 square miles, and even though it's a traditional school district, they have a lot of control, a lot of faith, a lot of credibility. You're dealing with a city. Just read this morning, Philadelphia basically is still not teaching. You're doing the opposite. Tell us kind of what you're doing and how.
Yes, good morning. I work for the Philadelphia School Partnership. We are a funder in Philadelphia that mainly funds schools to expand students and families' access to high quality options. We fund across all 3 sectors. So Catholic, we've worked with Stephanie before funding a school in Philly that she used to work with. We fund in the charter sector and we fund in the district sector. As an organization, our first response to this was we raised about $4 million in a couple of weeks to purchase Chromebooks for all the families in the charter and Catholic sectors that needed them. The district had already raised some money from some big funders in town to do similar initiative just for districts, and so we wanted to make sure the same opportunity existed in the charter and Catholic sectors. Jeannie's right, we're a big city. We have 240,000 students, and estimates vary, but it's somewhere between 15 and 30% of the families didn't have the devices or internet access to be able to get online. And so that's a lot of families. You know, if it's 25% of 240,000, we're talking 60,000 students that we got to deal with on that front. So the past week, my team has been at a school in town helping schools, other schools, to come through and pick up their Chromebooks, which all came in or are coming in sort of on a staggered basis this week. So that's going pretty smoothly. Our next big agenda item on that front will be sort of conquering the last mile from an internet access standpoint. We are a Comcast city, and Comcast has made their Internet Essentials program free for 60 days for families to sign up and get internet through Comcast, which is a solution that works for many families, but not all. And so in the next couple of weeks, we want to work with schools to figure out who are those families who still can't connect, and what solutions can we develop there to mitigate that. And then we're staying in touch with our schools, and we're seeing a really diverse array of responses there. We have one school that knew they had an internet access issue, and so they immediately, their whole virtual plan is built around smartphones. Almost every student has a smartphone, or their parents do. And so rather than try to deal with the Chromebook and internet access, they just jumped right into a smartphone-driven online learning plan. We have other schools that were already one-to-one, and so they were able to jump in very quickly. And even in the school district, Jeannie, I would say, while the official edict is that they're not really doing it yet, we've seen entrepreneurial principals and teachers in that system jump right in. I mean, I have an employee whose kids, both of her children go to district schools. Both of her children were doing online lessons within 5 days of this whole thing starting. And you know, they were for a while there, they were technically in violation of the official policy, but that didn't stop them. They just kept trying to engage with their students. So we're seeing a lot of that.
As if there should be an official policy saying you should not teach. I mean, what's wrong with this picture, Mark?
So it's kind of a wild west right now. We're really pleased. We have funded about 60 schools in the city over the last 7 or 8 years. We call those our portfolio schools, and that represents about 1/6 of the total number of schools in the city. And across our portfolio, we've seen some really impressive ability to adapt and get students and teachers online in productive ways. We have one school, it's small, granted, so this goes back to the scale issue. They're only in their first year, they have 160 students, but they're running a full 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. class day every day with gym class and art class and English class and math class. And so that's been really great to see. We've gotten requests from some schools for simple. So many organizations are pushing out great long lists of resources.
Right.
But it's overwhelming to teachers, in some cases, and to a parent who's not familiar with doing this. It's a little bit of a fire hose. And so we got a request from some schools here. We need something really simple for families whose kids are in kindergarten, first, second grade, just to be able to read books online. And so our team pulled together over the course of a few days a resource of 30 books aimed at kindergarten, first and second grade that require no login. It's super easy. You click on the link and the book comes up, and the parent can turn the page at their own pace, and the child can read, or the parent can read, or in some cases there's a narrator online if you want to turn up the audio and they can be the reader. So we're trying to navigate a balance between supporting the schools that want to do it in a more sophisticated manner,
Right.
and making sure there are some very basic resources that schools that are less well prepared can plug into as well.
And so that's the low tech answer, right? And so, you know, a lot of people, I do think that there is this concern. We've certainly heard it from a lot of parent groups and people who represent parents that whether they have access or not, and there's still a debate, is it 80%, is it 60%, who's got those numbers, whether they have access or not, so much of education, even if you're remote, is learning by looking at something, by studying it, by working in a text, right? We all have paper still. We're all working. I'm sure all of your desks look like mine. We've got stuff behind. Look at Greg. We still have books. So Stephanie, you sent stuff home. Mark, you're responding by at least giving them something clickable. How do we answer this challenge now for everyone listening and for kind of perpetuity, that remote learning isn't just a computer? And I want you to each answer that, how you would tackle it. Like right now, even if you can't get to those kids physically, how you help them. And also, are your resources or ideas or what you're doing, slightly related, available to everybody? Because those are like critical needs we have now. So jump in, whoever who wants to take that. Mark, you want to start with that?
The first thing I would say is you have to, from my perspective, you have to look at this differently by grade level. Like how you can do remote learning for high school students is going to look a lot different than how it looks for kindergartners or second graders. You know, high school students can be self-directed. So if you give them the right tools and the right access, I think you can expect a lot of them. I think the challenge with the younger students is there still needs to be a high level of teacher interaction. And so, you know, what I've been most impressed with are the schools where teachers are checking in with students every day. You know, they're either calling them or they're setting up a Zoom or a FaceTime situation. But, you know, depending on whether the parents are in the house helping or whether they're off doing an essential job really changes the dynamic there for a younger learner. So I think the teacher interaction part is the critical component, especially in the younger grades.
Greg, let me pull you into that. Is it too much to ask a teacher to call the kids?
No, I actually have two responses. The first one would be our superintendent. His first priority was obviously reaching out to every student, and that was a mandate that came out the first week, that we had to use whatever means necessary, be it GoToMeeting, Seesaw, Facebook, something, but we needed to have confirmation that all of our kids were safe and okay. That was his first directive. So that was, I would say, absolutely tantamount to everything that we did. That was our first priority. Then to Mark's point, and Mark, I couldn't agree with you more. I think what we've been pushing is simple, is going to be adhered to. I mean, people are gonna buy simple, right? Complex, too complex, we're gonna burn people out. And so we started using, we had a difficult time with professional development in the district and the number of days that we had. So we created a Guerrilla PD, which is a 20-minute, just like a guerrilla strike. Just, it's not the large group, it's just very small number of people, targeted attack with a specific skill set. And we have found that taking that Guerrilla PD model, so let's say a teacher has a question about a tech tool, and she would email me and she'd say, I've got a question about this, I'm requesting a Guerrilla PD. Then I would say to her, can you please grab 2 or 3 others who are like-minded so that we can have a small little group. I come in with a hyperdoc so they don't have to take notes. They get a little tiny ticket that has that hyperdoc on it. They type it in and it quickly comes up on their screen. And then we have one concept or one competency. In and done, boom. When I leave, you should be able to do this. If not, then we'll go back and we'll do another Guerrilla PD and so on and so forth. And what we're finding is those small tactical surgical strikes on specific job embedded needs that the teachers have, well, they were working in the bricks and mortar. And what we're finding is those are working really well in Zoom sessions, because we're asking our people to say, look, take everything and refine it down to what's the one thing you want them to leave being able to do. And so we've been able to run a lot of Guerrilla PD sessions through Zoom. And it's been again, one of those lucky happenstances that it's transitioned well for us, and teachers are leaving being able to make those transitions. But Mark, to your point, I think simplicity is key here. And I think going slow and making sure that we realize that there's human beings on both ends of the system is incredibly important. So,
Jamie, how does that jive with what you're seeing? And if you can concretely also, to Gregg's point, kind of what are those specific skills, like what are the things people can be doing now, sort of the practical tools?
I think, you know, both Mark and Gregg said it really well. We did with the first couple of weeks of just find anything we can to figure out how we're going to do this. And now there's a lot. And so we have to step back and say effective. How do we get to deep instruction? How do we do both synchronous and asynchronous? There is some level of student agency. And the most important thing, I think, there's 2 points that we really want to stress. First of all, virtual education has existed for a very long time. Teachers who are highly successful teaching students at all ages effectively has existed for decades. There are best practices that have existed for decades and morphed over time, and I'd really encourage folks to understand those. Like, we don't have to recreate, this is not new. But what we've been talking a lot to schools about is educators need to close their eyes and you need to imagine your physical classroom as a brick and mortar educator and the way that you differentiated instruction and you moved through your stations and what you use your core instructional model and the tools that you use supplementally. And when you boil all of that down as an educator and you think about it in just a very simple context, like your regular classroom, you use fewer versus not more. And so if you look at what's been happening in the last couple of weeks, there's been just like, go here. And parents, you know, I know, Jeanne, you're hearing a lot of this from the parent groups is I've got a 4th grader and a 1st, and I was looking at what was being put on the SIS and I'm like, oh my goodness. I mean, 1st grader can't figure out how to find these 15 different link things that we're trying to do, right? So it's stepping back and saying, okay, envision your classroom the way that you've physically done this as a math teacher for years, and now recreate that in the virtual environment and leverage. We need to learn, we need to go slow, I agree with that, and really learn how to leverage these tools, that all of the tools that exist virtually, they're here, we need some modifications, but we need to figure out how to simplify what we're doing so that we really can recreate the classroom that we have typically used in brick and mortar if possible. It's not entirely emulated, but it is absolutely possible to do that. And it's just really working through like how do we effectively use these models to bring my classroom back within my control? Because that's what a lot of teachers are asking is, how do I get my control back of what I know how to do with my kids, right? So it's really working through the models of how we do that.
You know, it makes me think about, I toured an online school once, right? And I was like, you want to introduce me to the teachers? I don't understand. There was teachers sitting in an office building and they had headsets on and different ones were talking to students. And I remember asking somebody later, she said she worked in traditional brick and mortar and traditional schools and charters, and she loved this virtual school because she actually felt she was actually a special needs teacher. She actually felt that she was spending more time with her students, but it took her a lot of time to visualize that.
Yeah.
Because originally she was like, how could I teach them? Well, if I'm on a phone and I'm talking directly to Sarah and helping Sarah learn, she said the difference was having the materials and understanding and knowing how to track them. And so that kind of training with materials, all with the phone. And yes, access to a computer, but most of it didn't need the computer. Stephanie, are you seeing that in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I would amen to keep it simple. We call that KISS, K-I-S. I would say 3 other things to really think about how to guide this work. 1, prioritize the right C's. So what do I mean by that? Compassion, community, and culture over compliance for everyone. And I see Gregg shaking his head. He's absolutely right. We cannot lose the human element of this. All children thrive on routines and clear expectations. Zoom calls work incredibly well, although there is some legislation in New York City that has said we can no longer use Zoom. We believe that if you train teachers on how to use Zoom safely for children, it can be incredibly effective, but we're going to be watching that space for our charter schools in New York City. Our Catholic schools are absolutely using Zoom. That personal face-to-face contact really matters. And compliance, yes, it's necessary, but it is not sufficient. My next point would be, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Okay, yes, you need a thoughtful plan, but stay flexible and responsive. I think I mentioned that we send out information waves. So consider what the needs are for your teachers, leaders, families, children in the week that you're at, and then scaffold the way that you send out information. And then lastly, I would say, don't forget Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The sudden switch to fully remote learning for an extended period of time puts especially vulnerable students in an even more vulnerable position. So we at our network of schools have meaningfully upped our game when it comes to mental and emotional health. And in our Catholic schools, we include spiritual health. And so who are our most vulnerable children? How can we support them? That includes meals, safe places for children to go, housing security for entire families. We're figuring out how to address the most urgent needs now, but we have not taken our foot off the pedal when it comes to learning. So that was in place because of good planning and kind of nonstop working hours over the course of 1 to 3 days. I mean, everybody on the team was not sleeping, and they rallied, and I'm so proud of them. But this is very doable. I think keep it simple. And then those other points that I mentioned, I would use those as your guiding principles.
And so, you know, and anybody jump in here too, when you talked about, you know, other than the compassion part, other than obviously you have to see these students, and no one can envision yet a world, or doesn't think we're going to be in a world where everyone's learning virtually. But as Jamie mentioned, we're realizing that it should not take a pandemic. Like in New Orleans, it shouldn't have taken a hurricane. We say this over and over again, to realize that our students who are digital natives, regardless of access, have the capacity and the ability to work in different ways. And is this the time to introduce it? Everyone keeps asking, what's the system look like, or what do schools look like when we go back? How does this change, if at all? And yes, is there an agenda, right? I had a reporter ask me the other day, well, isn't another agenda bring around choice? Well, no, but it is actually revealing that we're not prepared for fluctuations that we could never even imagine. So do you start building more remote, more capacity for digital learning into your program at Seton?
Yes.
I'll go back tomorrow.
Yes, and I'll let others answer, but Jeannie, you've been talking about this for decades. We need to focus on the ends, not the means. So what are the ends? Great character, great academics for our Catholic schools, faith, and then be agnostic to the means for delivering on those 3 good ends. And so I think that this is an unprecedented opportunity to think differently about learning for all children. I think planning for when schools come back, we're already starting to do that, but it is early to be doing that. Some people are really rightly focused on the needs of their existing students right now. But we're having conversations, beginning conversations about what does this look like when schools reopen. And since we're already robust blended learning schools, we've been taking advantage of technology to do individualized instruction for our kiddos. But I think that there's an opportunity to be more creative and do things differently for all of our kids.
We see, you know, coming back being very relative and very chaotic over the next year. You know, we know this. We need to have a vaccine, and we need to have something in place where we can feel like there's stability back in the system, and that's going to take us a while to get there. And so I think one of the things that we really see right now across the country when schools and students return back to quote unquote a new normal is, I think, as horrible as this pandemic is for this entire globe, one of the things for education is the level of comfort that educators will have using different tools and trying new and different things and embracing blended learning or flipped classrooms in a way that potentially hadn't existed prior in terms of their instructional strategies, and instructional leaders within school systems really understanding the power of individualized instruction. We talk a lot at EdMentum that you can build school around every student, and we mean it. And that is a combination of great educators and great tools that allow you to differentiate that instruction and really get to the core of what is needs in that moment. And so as hard as it is to thrust us into this technology to understand what all works, what's going to happen is we're going to come out on the other side and say, wow, there are some really new and innovative things that we can do within our traditional classroom setting to serve kids in a really meaningful way and in a deeper way and in an individualized way that maybe we hadn't explored prior to this. So that's our view of what we think will look like. Chaotic for a while, rolling, opening, and closing, but coupled with really great innovation and a preparedness of our educators that we maybe wouldn't have ever gotten to had we not run into this kind of crisis.
And that preparedness, I would imagine, again, requires some level, I'm just going to be really clear, flexibility.
Yeah.
Right? Systems that don't have the flexibility, organizations that don't have the flexibility can't get there quickly. And so while you don't want to build your educational program or operate your district, Greg, on everything could change, you have to have the flexibility to shift, just like in any other environment, right?
Yep.
Mark, are you seeing that your schools and your members, if you will, or those you support that are doing it differently have that flexibility?
Yes, definitely. I think we're seeing the most, the biggest ability to sort of react and implement plans and get learning going in the charter sector, where schools have more flexibility. And in the district, we're seeing it in the schools that have leaders who are entrepreneurial and who buck against the system a little bit. Ask for permission later, kind of leaders. And so I think that's real. At the same time, I want to say, this is a city where 2/3 of students don't read on grade level. And, what our team is also trying to stay focused on here is the majority of our students were in trouble before this crisis.
Right.
And now they're in bigger trouble. And these virtual tools are exciting, but there still are huge questions about how well you can make them work for students who bring enormous deficits to school. Like they're not reading on grade level yet. And so a lot of the grade level material is hard to deliver to them in a productive way. And the question of what school looks like when we come back, I don't think we've figured it out yet. I do think, but I don't think.
Go back, right, but that's such a great point, and I'm going to challenge you all on this point. So we know that entrepreneurial leaders, no matter what sector, public, private, charter, right, will act and operate. Look at Witness who's here and what we've been reading about. Whereas LA and others, they're trying to figure it out. They're like, well, we're going to wait. I heard it. I'm just going to be provocative here. Randy Weingarten was on television the other night. My Catholic guilt got to me because it was Good Friday and I had the news on, and I saw the head of the AFT saying that the way they're going to address this is by voluntary summer school, and they need federal money to help with voluntary summer school. That's not the response to the 2/3 of kids who can't read, write, or spell at grade level, right? So you can't go back the same way and expect things to change, and you can't do it all differently and expect things to change. So what can we do to take these lessons to actually help kids accelerate, right? Is there an answer to that yet, or is it something we already know?
Well, I think it's something that we've always explored, in this, it's part of. I'm going to talk a theory real quick, and I apologize. I'm one of those guys who always relies on theory. But Pip Coburn came out. He's a technologist, and he basically said that if we're going to have, he wrote the book, The Change Function. Basically, you take any technology, and if it's a tool, is it a tool that's going to catch on and make a difference in the human experience? He basically said it's really simple. There's a function. your perceived problem has to be greater than the total perceived pain of adoption. So when I would go out and do talks about, I do mini tech talks all over the country, and when I would go out and do those, in some cases, I would have to create that perceived problem in the minds of the audience so that the perceived pain of adoption of this new tool seemed worthwhile. And so I think we are in a unique situation in the educational world, and that's now all of us, right? We look at that and we say, okay, so the perceived problem is there is now a forced gap between our learners and our educators. We're expecting technology to help fill that gap. And as Mark clearly said, and Stephanie as well, there were learning gaps going back to A Nation at Risk in the 80s, right? So I'm not saying technology is the only thing that can fill that gap. I do think that we need to leverage our teachers. I think we need to leverage our organizations. But I think part of what we, as you know, entrepreneurial leaders, I think we need to set a course now so that when we get to the end of this, we are in a different place. I don't think, and I think that's our job as organizations and as teams, and I know our administrative team in Columbia is looking at what will we look like whenever it is that we come back. What will we look like, and what do we need to look like to better serve our parents and our students? And I think that's the key. One last thing, and then I'll yield. We also were trying to push with our teachers, and we found this early on, because I think it's just human nature. We push a lot of, if you're familiar with Norman Webb's depth of knowledge, level 1 is just a quick recall, you know something. We tend to push a lot of those activities on students, and we put a quantity, we put a lot of those in place. And as a result, we say that the time spent doing those is time well spent. What we've been charging our teachers with is something that we wanted prior to the pandemic, and that is reaching depth of knowledge levels 3 and 4, so that we're actually challenging our students to go to what Jamie said much earlier in our webinar,
which is competency, right? Competency.
Absolutely,
right?
and free thought. No, absolutely. And if the students can demonstrate that to us in authentic ways, you know, we tend to think that we have to be in total control. I think in some cases we need to abdicate our control a little bit, give up a little bit of that ultimate purveyor of information from the front of the classroom.
Right.
More of those facilitator, where we're facilitating, allowing kids to construct their own.
The notion of agency, right?
Absolutely.
So absolutely, and sort of that ties in with one of the questions we have from our participants, Susan, who is in a regional public high school, and she says, we're faced with trying to cover material from the balance of the year versus enrichment, deeper learning, and it's more difficult to do in a school with 2,000 students. Of course, Susan, you're not asking me per se. There are other experts on the phone, but I'd say I think we have to stop the 2,000 person high school. Let's start there. But you can't do that necessarily just yet. What would you say to someone, friends, panelists, about a 2,000 plus student high school that you've got to transition with? Jamie, Stephanie, what do you think?
I think it's possible. So I would, again, don't let the enemy, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. I think that the balance between planning and working for what children needs now, what children and families need now, versus planning for what school looks like next year, I think that is a tricky and delicate balance, and we're still trying to work that out. But I think there are many low-hanging fruits that people on this panel have already talked about, and I would start picking those.
I agree. I think, you know, looking at the way in which you would typically do this if you were back in your physical district is group your students, break down your specialists, look at ways to organize. And I think I heard a lot of the panelists today talk about how quickly get into an agile mode of operation. That's what's really important right now is none of us are doing this perfectly, but if you can organize yourself in such a way, even in the large urban districts, we're seeing this happen. I actually think New York City is doing an incredible job in a lot of different things right now. You know, they're serving 1.1 million students, and to look at how fast the district has been able to transition and looking at how they're breaking down into very agile models of trying something, seeing if it works, the way in which they think about enrichment, intervention, using a lot of data analysis on a very regular basis, right? Because one of the values of virtual learning, especially if you're using some of the more consolidated tools, you're going to get a ton of data on demand very quickly. And so moving to more data-driven instruction and evaluation and really looking at like, how do we create a more nimble model so that we can scale it to serve the large number of students that we have within the system. I would really encourage just more nimbleness and more agility to work through some of the models that you're trying right now with your educators.
And I think you're hitting on something that a lot of people have concerns about, but this predates the pandemic. And for our friends out there whose main focus is standards and data, it's the data, right? We have programs. There are, whether you want to call them curriculum or programs or school models, where you provide a student with something and then you assess whether they're getting it. You come back and you regroup again and again. It's lacking from a lot of school districts, not because the people in those districts are bad or don't know about it, because it's so glacially slow to adopt or develop data systems and standards. And so this may force that, right? Mark, what do you think?
I don't know if it will or not, Jeannie. I like to think big, and I would like to see, I think this is an opportunity to rethink everything. You know, I expect schools, depending on how states handle education funding, it could trickle down more gradually than an immediate impact in August, but schools are facing significant budget cuts, I think. I mean, if state budgets get hit as badly as we think they're going to, that's going to roll down to K-12 education. And even if there's some stimulus money to plug that hole in the short term, over the next 2, 3, 4 years, I think schools are looking at a declining resources environment. And so I would love to see schools zero-based budget and zero-base the whole operation. Like, let's redefine what we're trying to accomplish here. I think one of the things we've talked about on this call is differentiated learning. Mm-hmm. But we still have a system where we define the goals pretty much for the same for all students, right? And then we talk about differentiating the instruction to get to the same goal. You know, is there a way to peel that back further and talk about how do we differentiate even the goals for different students? I just think this is an opportunity. I don't know if we're going to take advantage of it as a society, but what we're doing is not working well enough. You know, for the most part, schools aren't changing enough. Most of the money is going into legacy stuff like pension funds and teacher contracts that are completely out of date with the way kids are learning today. Like, we need to rethink all of that stuff. And if I were a superintendent or a school leader, I'd be going to my board and saying, this is a chance to rethink everything.
It's a great
but I don't know. I don't know if we're ready for that.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, right? And especially when you have contracts being negotiated, limiting teachers to 4 hours a day of classroom instruction. Again, there are districts that do things like that, which are ridiculous and I think mind-blowing and anti-student. There are districts doing what Gregg is doing. And you know, let me, you know, there's a lot of great questions and all of you, we will connect you with the people who can especially answer you if we don't get to them all. And Michael, if you want to jump back in, happy to have you, but let me throw out a crazy idea about that, right? So if every educator out there listening, if every school leader, if every policy advocate, if every parent out there on this call were actually allowed to use the money for their education to figure out their own education during this time. In other words, the money is flowing. It's in this districts. Then there's more money that's just been allocated. And yet We're not sure who has internet. Not everybody has a device. Packets aren't getting to people. And you kind of go, well, wouldn't money drive some changes if money were flowing differently? And maybe this is the time to start saying that money should not be going any more than a child goes to a hospital based on where they live, that a child's funds shouldn't be just stuck in that school. If maybe that parent or caregiver or somebody wants to take those funds and use that for their education, obviously within the school, right? But I can show up and say to Greg in Columbia, Pennsylvania, hey, give me that packet and give me the device. And I know you've got a little pool of money for me. Let me go, help me do this. Is that radical, or is that where we're moving to?
There's nothing radical about that. It is not a crazy idea. And whether the political forces allow us to get there remains to be seen. But truly, I mean, parents have so much more power than they realize. And one of our mottos across all of our schools is you honor parents as the first educators. It comes from our Catholic heritage, but we do that across all of our schools. And so I'm going to choose to be hopeful, Jeannie, and grateful to you for asking the right questions, and ask you to please keep asking them, because I do think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity.
I think,
so Jeannie, Jamie, please go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say, I think, we talk about parent advocacy a lot. In the last couple of weeks, I cannot tell you, we've run some surveys and we've run some webinars, and I'll get on the phone with my local banker or rescheduling, a doctor appointment that I can't go to right now because of the conditions. And the first conversation with somebody who has a child in K through 12 right now is the level of frustration, the dual working parents who are having complete emotional breakdowns right now because they feel like they're failing their students. I think a lot of people have taken for granted just what happens during the school day for our kids, to have that put on you as a parent, and to see the things that you think are working and not working for your child. I think we're going to see a rise of parent involvement from all of this that we have never seen before. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it'll help push some of these conversations that need to be had around what is in the best interest for our students and our communities.
And I think Zeus's question to this, Michael, what do you think, really is also on this. He's asking, like, a lot of people are saying that, he's asking how can school leaders communicate best to their families and staff the need for students to continue learning, because they're being made to feel like they shouldn't be having this conversation because there's so much on parents. Aren't parents welcoming those answers?
Well,
Go ahead, Greg.
no, Mark, go ahead, buddy.
I was just going to add, I do think what I'm hearing from parents is a newfound appreciation for what teachers do every day. And I think they would be super receptive to guidance if it came from teachers as to how they can better support their children in the learning process. I think the messenger is critical here. I think parents, they always valued teachers, but I think that's much higher now.
So let me take three. Go ahead, Greg, if you want to jump in, and then I'm going to take three questions and combine them into one. So Greg, go ahead.
Real quick here. I'm also the federal programs coordinator, and as part of my Title I responsibility, I have 1% of my total allocation for parent and family engagement. And in the 4 years I've been in this district, and it's a wonderful district, it's been difficult to get families out simply because of two-income families and second shift and so on and so forth. We can never really find that good time. That's why we did, and Jeannie, you and I talked about this, and you had asked me to bring it up towards the end. So we put together a database of a Google site of free resources, so that the first day that we were out, so that would have been on the 15th, on the 16th, our first day out, no school, our students, at least our families, had resources that they could access. And yes, there's a lot. We've tried to curate them, but what we tried to do, we have social emotional learning in there. Thanks to my wife, Carrie. She is an amazing special education teacher, works with autistic students. And one of our biggest concerns in the district was not reaching our most vulnerable populations. And so she very quickly shared, and if you have a moment to check out our site, it's worthwhile. We have local social service agencies. You can tell that they were trying to change their methodologies very quickly to meet their learners. So, you know, I don't want to name any, well, no, I will name them. Aaron's Acres, they work with special ed kids. There's no kids coming to Aaron's Acres. So you can tell late March, they launched a YouTube channel and they put on videos and they're producing videos very much out of their comfort zone, but they're meeting students where they are. Fitness for Focus, gym specializing in adaptive special education, physical training, videos. They're launching these. So they're doing these things to get out to families. And I think right now it's pivotal that we show families, and I agree with everyone, we need to be that voice of reason. We did start the engine of public education back up on our little borough. And I think it's our job to constantly fine tune it and manage it and protect it to make sure that it continues to run for everyone. I think that's the key. So.
Great, thank you. You answered one of them, which was how are we reaching those last few students that we're not reaching? Two questions. One, what does summer look like? Do you start to use more of summer and continue with programs throughout and kind of ditch the, hey, let's all take 3 months off? And then the second part, how do you view the value or the irrelevance of an interim assessment on your students right now? Is it worth doing something right now, or are you just going to muck up education and try to get back to it? So if you could all touch on those two quickly, we would appreciate it.
We have all of our schools take NWEA map, beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year. It allows us to compare kiddos across state lines, which is really important if you're a national organization. And then EdMentum, we use one of your programs that allows you to upload NWEA map results and actually craft an individualized instructional plan for every child.
Exact path, yes, thank you.
But we had already, sorry, a little plug there.
Yeah,
But we already had done our mid-year assessments, and we have made the decision not to do an end-of-year assessment. We don't think the data is actually going to be as useful as it would otherwise be, and we're big fans of NWEA map. So I'll say that we made that decision. And what was the other part of the question?
Summer.
We have a longer school day, longer school year already. So we end in mid-June and we start back up in August. So our plans for the summer are not gonna change.
I would like to see schools try to go back early in the fall. You know, if you normally start after Labor Day, I think this is a good opportunity this year to say, we got to make up some time. Let's come back in August. Now, air conditioning, it becomes an issue in Philly. A lot of schools don't have air conditioning, and that can be problematic if it's 97 degrees outside. But I think this is an opportunity to rethink summer. I mean, we have, somebody mentioned, I forget if it was Stephanie or somebody else, we have schools here that did school through spring break because they said the kids can't go on vacation anyway, so we might as well make use of the time to catch up a little bit. I would like to see schools get creative about time.
Well, maybe part of the creativity, if I can just answer also, Michael, but maybe part of the creativity we all work on together is they're not going back and sitting in a physical classroom for 8 hot hours. Maybe they're going and picking up a packet. Maybe there's part of this digital, blended, remote, hybrid, whatever you want to call it, in the next century happening so that students have constant access. Because guess what? Dr. Fauci, the most popular man in the world today, made it very, very clear that kids may have to go back, students may have to stop going to school at lots of different points in time if this thing continues to emerge or re-emerge at different times. So if we don't figure it out between now and, let's say, June, August, we're going to be back in the same boat, right?
And an earlier question to that, Jeannie, how can we take potentially master teachers who then are trained quickly and help them train and bring along? Do we do paraprofessionals? Do we do, younger teachers, get them trained up on virtual and then be able to do that sort of approach, almost like healthcare, where you may go see a nurse practitioner or somebody else who necessarily isn't a doctor, but can handle these types of things? Can anyone speak to that? That was an earlier question.
I would say all of those models should be tried. The point on what does summer look like, we're talking to a lot of districts all over the country about this, and a lot of SCAs right now are working on formal guidance and or policies. And there's a moment right now, we talked about data, capture as much data right now as you can on what is working and not working. There needs to be a break for administrators and educators to step back and say, okay, we know that in the fall and through the winter and however long this pandemic continues on in whatever capacity it continues on until we have a real solution, it's not going to be normal state of business for anybody. And so how do we step back? How do we evaluate what we've tried that has worked really well? How do we evaluate what hasn't and try to fill the holes? And I think some of the models in other industries is a great way to explore that. We have a lot of younger educators who have grown up as a digital native, that this is flawless for them to be able to jump around and use all the various tools. What a cool opportunity to leverage their expertise and work with master teachers from a pedagogical perspective to really work through new models. I would say from the interim perspective, just to tie back to that, what we think is really important right now is you still have to have a diagnostic. You have to figure out, okay, if you look at some of the research coming out, NWA just published some on learning loss. It is very real. Versus the couple-week stop that we had, and now the potential slide, given the limited instructional time that students are experiencing between now and summer. We can't expect students to come back in whatever fall is defined as being ready. There's always summer slide. It is going to be so perpetuated this year across the country. And so we would just really encourage people to step back and say, okay, let's evaluate what our new normal is going to look like for the next 12 months. Let's look at how to leverage some of the interims and formative tools that we can to figure out where kids are at, and let's start steering our resources and our planning for next year towards addressing those gaps. And that's all very possible over the next 4 months.
And Jamie, what are specifically some of those assessment tools? Obviously, they're not state assessments. So give some folks out there logistics, assessments that they could use.
Even to the state assessments, though, if you look at Smarter Balance and some of the interim tools that Smarter Balance provides, I think that, a lot of people use those diagnostically. And so you've got what we would call those lower stakes assessments. EdMentum, we have a great partnership, as Stephanie just talked about, with NWA. The map is used all over the country. You've got Renaissance Star. You've got a lot of other, both district developed benchmarks as well that are very effective. Most folks, when this stop happened, when distance learning started, most had just come off their winter benchmark, or happened shortly after the winter benchmark. So there's that data you can use to get you the rest of the year. What I know a lot of the benchmark providers, and we're doing this at EdMentum too, are preparing right now is, for most of you that use like an NWA, that the conditions, you essentially create a high stakes testing environment when people do the MAP, or when students do the MAP testing. All these organizations right now are working on how you can actually administer that assessment at the beginning of the year if students are not allowed back into our buildings. And so there's going to be some really good ways to do initial measurement that will then help you plan for the instructional challenges and gaps because they're going to be perpetuated. We know this, right? We've already got students all over the country that are struggling and not on grade level. Get ready. When you come back in fall, it is going to be a much, much higher percentage. And so what are we going to do about that? There will never be a more important time to leverage the data and to differentiate instruction and to take time to really evaluate how you're going to do that as a system. So we think you need that time a little bit here, between late spring and early summer. So really would encourage people to explore those different options.
So assessment has to continue, right, as we start closing. Internally, externally, whether or not, it's going to count, but you using it to help drive education, right? That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing lots of resources, connectivity with parents, communication. Some of you are familiar with the resources Gregg has. We have some of his posted on our site. any of you who are giving away, sharing, modeling, training, raise your hand for anybody who can kind of reach out and call. I think that's critical, right? As we build these new communities, Facebook, support for online learning, Facebook, Tilly Elfram wrote a note in Q&A. What else are we missing as we close? What's the one thing that we haven't figured out that we can then take forth as we begin to build a policy dialogue? Because leadership at the state level in particular and local level is critical. And whether it's talking to them about how money should flow, what the expectations are, flexibility, is there anything we have not covered so that as we begin to build, because we all woke up this morning and just said, okay, we're really excited for this, but to be honest, we're getting a little impatient. We love you guys. We could have 15 of you on every single day, every hour, as are like lots of our colleagues. There's tons of webinars. But really, we've got to change the environment so that everyone who is a student and a parent out there has someone like you guys triaging their education. And maybe that's the system change that we're talking about, but is there anything else we should be leaving people with?
Yes, actually there is. Back years ago, I don't want to say I was a technophobe, but I was definitely I was an English teacher in a prior life. And so, I very much liked my books, my classroom, things worked well for me. School worked well for me. Why change it? I was successful and I came back, and, you know, we're the best self-perpetuating system on the planet, right? Those who find success come back and stay their lives there. But a buddy of mine turned me on to Twitter. And when I started my master's program, I began using Twitter. And if you're talking about policy changes, one of the biggest policy changes I'd like to see, my daughter's third grade teacher, I walked into her classroom when I was getting ready to write my dissertation. I was walking into her classroom and there were these little tiny, do you remember those little handwriting cards, the little placards that you used to have? She had them at knee height all the way around the room with a Facebook sticker on them. And it said, "What's your status?" And the kids walked in with little dry erase markers and wrote their status. And on a gallery walk, she was able to quickly tell how her class was feeling that day. That's great for culture. And I went up to her, and I taught in the same district that my kids went to school. And I said, "Hey, so where did you get that idea?" She goes, "Well, I got that off of," and then she got bright red. She goes, "I got that off of Twitter." And I'm like, "No, that's great." And she said, actually 6 out of the 7 activities I have around my room here came from there. And so my dissertation topic was leveraging Web 2.0 tools and social media. We have an incredibly vibrant culture of teachers who are not getting professional development because large districts, and even small districts like mine, I can't meet the needs of all learners, of all of my professional learners. And so having Twitter, Instagram, teachers pay teachers to some respect, YouTube. There are so many different social media and Web 2.0 tools that I would encourage all of us to connect. And I'll be honest with you, one of the things I'm most excited about today is I now have connected all of the people I hope in this panel to my virtual community of practice. And now when I have an issue, I now have a team behind me. And so I would, if anything, I would say 2 things. I would encourage everyone to get on those tools because they're fantastic and they can connect you. And number 2, Jeannie, to your point, start to push policy that starts to grant honest to goodness professional development time to the teachers who are leveraging these tools. Why do we make them sit in an auditorium for 7 hours and sign in and sign out? And I know for a fact I have those very same teachers who jump on their own time because they're professionals and they're dedicated and they love their students and they want better for them. I think policy-wise, I'm sorry, sort of grandstanding here, but I really, we could get more people on social media, more teachers, and start granting them the credit they deserve. I think that's key.
Yeah.
Yep. Tremendous, vibrant connection going on across social media today. It's pretty amazing to watch the parents and teachers talking.
Right.
Yeah, and we did have one question in general. It's about just in Nashville trying to deal with the pandemic, tornadoes, everything. I think part of the answer to you that we're trying to get to here is that we're going to share our resource list again. All of you have very politely shared all of your information. We're going to get back and answer that question later, but Jeannie, do you want to wrap up now? Should we keep on going?
Yeah, no, I think
we
we
have
should
a lot of interested people.
Yeah, we should respect everyone's time and continue to figure out the best way to support the group going forward. I'd say that the Nashville question about Nashville is ubiquitous, right? It's the systems aren't providing enough stuff. They're not getting it out to enough people. You know, whether Mark was talking about Comcast, is it getting to everybody, or the devices being handed out? I don't understand. I kind of do, but I don't understand why Miami could give out 56,000 devices in 3 days, within 3 days of shutting down, and others are still dragging along. And so I think this comes back to, is there a plan to help public education? The plan should be that we demand that the funds and the resources that are already in the system be routed to the needs of every single student that has bandwidth over their head, underneath and around side of their computer, and the device they need. It should be, as I once said, strapped to their back like a backpack full of cash. It should follow the student. And so if there's somebody out there, there should be some way for everyone in Nashville to raise their hand and say, I don't have it. And we should be asking those superintendents and leaders why. And until then, we cannot rely only on philanthropy. We cannot rely only on an entrepreneurial district or two or a bunch of charter networks. It has to be that policy push, I'd argue. And so I'd invite everybody out there to ask that question and to look to people like this in the meantime. Sort of, there's a level. There are people who are doing this as best they can, learning lessons. There are some who are delivering education exceptionally while training and trying to triage their professional development for teachers. There are teachers, parents, and students who are flailing. We should come to the rescue of them with as much support as we can, make it count, and continue to mine data and allow and encourage people to reveal what their lessons are so we can learn from it and turn it over again, if that makes sense. So that's my grandstanding, and I just want to thank everybody for being with us. Gregg McGough, Jamie Candee, Mark Gleason, Stephanie Saroki de Garcia, Michael Musante, my colleague, all of you out there who joined us. Please ping us, send more questions our way for our guests, and all of you, just grateful for what you're doing. This is a critical, it is that critical moment in time that is not a cliche. So thank you for doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie, for inviting us.
Thank you.
It's been a privilege to represent Columbia Borough here, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregg. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bless you all.